Oh, let's do this. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be talking about my writing projects that I worked on this past year. I'm like low-key nervous to make this video. I know it's technically the season of goal setting right now, and I was like considering maybe doing a goal setting video. But to be honest, like, I kind of like the freedom of just being able to jump around on projects and stuff like that. So I do have personal like 2022 writing goals, but they're always subject to change. And I kind of don't want like the pressure of making those goals public because the chances of me like changing what I want to work on is pretty high. So in lieu of, making a goal setting video, I thought it would be fun to just kind of talk about what I accomplished this year. And I feel like since I started authortube, I've been really scared to speak about my writing because I constantly start projects, abandon them, etc. And I also just lack a lot of confidence in myself. In my last writing vlog, I was basically rambling about how even though I've been writing for many years now, I honestly have no idea if I'm a good writer and what that even means and what the value of, those kinds of thoughts and self-doubt is. Why do I even have an authortube channel? So anyway, I was like editing that vlog yesterday and I just realized that I need to stop like second guessing myself like literally every time I write. And I guess one goal that I have for myself in 2022 is to practice speaking more kindly to myself about my writing instead of constantly having these like negative, self-deprecating thoughts. It really does not help my relationship with my writing to doubt myself all the time and to make myself like feel bad. Like I feel like I get into these states where it's like, I'm enjoying my writing and then I'm like, why am I enjoying it? My writing isn't even good. Like regardless of the quantity, I think whatever we produce is something to be proud of. I'm still super nervous to make this video, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so to start with my short fiction, I do like periodically get ideas for short stories and then I'll start writing them like 100 words, 300 words, 500 words, and then I'll just like abandon them. So I won't talk about like literally every story I started, but I'll talk about the ones that I'm actively drafting. So back in March, I started drafting a piece called Songs of the Era. The story is in its third draft and it's been beta read twice. I'm still revising it. I've been revising it I haven't touched it in 4 months, but I worked on it quite a bit at the start of the year. It takes place on an ocean liner in the early 20th century. It follows two characters who are from like two different social classes and they cross paths by accident on this ship, like Jack and Rose vibes. So I started writing this because I came across a piece of history earlier this year and I just could not get it out of my head. I was like basically researching like jazz history for some reason at the start of this year. And I came across these like articles about how Filipino musicians were some of the first musicians in Asia to learn jazz music because they learned it from American soldiers during the American occupation. And I was like really fascinated at the idea that jazz has a pretty rich history outside of America and outside of the West that I don't think is brought too much into popular culture when we think about like the jazz age. And so that kind of was the catalyst of the story. It's the reason that I made one of the characters in the short story a musician, a Filipino musician on the ocean liner band. And I kind of just wanted to write a piece that contemplated on the idea of home and belonging. And I felt like setting it on an ocean liner, that's like an ocean liner is like in the middle of the open sea. I felt like it was really conducive to that theme. I felt like there was a lot of interesting imagery that I could pull from in terms of like, the sense of in-betweenness and displacement that you feel when, you're not quite in one place with clearly defined borders. It also touches upon a little bit the idea of music and the role that music plays in transporting us mentally and emotionally. So that was kind of the vibe of Songs of the Era, and I don't really know like how I feel about it right now. It's like kind of hard for me to write historical fiction because like I don't know, there's just like a lot of research that goes into historical fiction, and I'm not sure like how much I want to really ground the piece in reality. And so I think tonally the piece is kind of like all over the place right now. I'm kind of like proud that I wrote it because it was like very out of my comfort zone. Okay, I also wrote a piece called Merienda this year. So this story follows a young woman who visits the Philippines for the first time after growing up in Canada, and it's pretty much a contemplation on ancestral roots and the alienation that you feel growing up between two different cultures. I feel all types of ways about this story. First and foremost, because this is the most like autobiographical piece I've ever written. I never write about myself in my writing, like even in my novels. Like I don't even journal. I don't even keep a diary. These days I'm just not really the type of person or the type of writer that likes to take an experience that I've had and like literally write about it. Mostly because, you know, it's very vulnerable to do that. And I've just like never found my own life particularly interesting. But this story came together after I had just visited the Philippines back in 2019. And I just remember I found it so fascinating seeing like this part of my family that I'd never known before. And I kept thinking like how different my life and my identity would have been if my parents had never emigrated. So obviously that like spiraled a whole bunch of thoughts. But the reason that this story really came together was because when I was in the Philippines, I got really physically ill. And it was genuinely because my body was like really unadjusted to the cuisine, the weather, and like all of the traveling that we did. And it was kind of this like surreal experience because it was like, it really felt like my body was almost like literally reacting to the feeling of like being in this foreign place and like being inundated. And it was strange because it was like, why do I feel like my body is rejecting my ancestral roots? And then on Christmas Eve, I was like lying in bed, shivering and vomiting. And I just remember like hallucinating an entire short story and thinking about how, you know, my experience here would have made a very interesting series of vignettes, fictionalized, obviously, with like some creative flourishes. But yeah, that's how the story came together because I was like kind of in a bit of a fever dream. Yeah, I've written a few of the vignettes already, but I wouldn't call it done yet because I think that there are still a few more I want to write. I just have to like figure out what those scenes would be. And yeah, it's like the most personal story I've ever written. I don't know what my publication plans are for it. I think right now it's like story is like too raw for me to make public. And the last short story that I worked on this year was called This Is Where We Dance. I would say this draft is like 50% done, and I'm still actively drafting it. So this story is about a group of high school students, high school seniors actually, and they're about to move away for university, and it's like the last night that they all have together before they all kind of like part ways and leave their small town for the first time. So on this night, they decide to break into an abandoned building. It's a story about like anxieties about the future and identity, adolescence. There's honestly not too much to say about this story. I still feel like I'm figuring it out. The town I set it in is inspired by the small town where I went to for university. And so in this town, there's a big abandoned building that sits right next to my old university campus, and it has this really rich history. And like I used to like stare out the window in class, and I used to think that this would be like a great place to set a ghost story. So I've been like dreaming about writing a story kind of like inspired by the vibes of that place for many years now, and this year I finally got around to drafting it. I actually started writing it during NaNoWriMo when I was just like in a bit of a mood. So this short story actually started as a novel idea, but I ended up shelving it for many years because, you know, I wanted to focus on my genre fiction. And then when I revisited the idea during NaNoWriMo, I was like, this would make a much better short story than it would like a full-length novel. So those are the short stories, and now we can talk about the novels. I worked on 2 novels and 1 novella this year. They are all fantasy projects. 1 novel is completed. The second one that I'm drafting right now is just over 75% done. Probably more by the time this video is uploaded. And the novella is like, I don't know. I don't really have a gauge on like the novella. I kind of wrote it spontaneously, but we'll start with the first book that I finished this year. If you were watching my vlogs from the start, you are probably familiar with this project. So I drafted this from March to July of this year. It is a young adult fantasy that pulls elements from Filipino mythology. It follows 4 characters who are traveling together. 4 of them have to journey across the empire, and they're doing it under the guise of a political voyage. But what they're really trying to do is recover this like missing artifact. However, the mage and the prince want this artifact for different reasons, and those reasons conflict. I'd say that this draft, I guess, takes elements of an adventure story, a political drama, an epic fantasy, but it's not quite any of them entirely. I have a whole separate video where I like talk about the entire drafting process of this story and how it came together. Long story short, it took me 3 years to write. Now that it's been fully written, I feel weird about it. Well, okay. I mean, now that I've had some time, like, you know, I've had several months now to like sit on it. So I'm not as like, my ego towards this book isn't as fragile as it used to be, let's just say. I don't really know like what else to say about this book that I haven't already said many times in like vlogs and in my video where I talked about the drafting process for this. I guess just to summarize, like, it was a very emotional experience to finish this book because I think when you're in the head of a character for 3 years, you just really get attached to them, you know? Because I felt like I really knew this cast of characters, it was kind of like an emotional drafting experience because I was like finally giving them an ending, you know? Particularly the relationship between the mage character and the prince character. They had one of my favorite dynamics to write, which was essentially like childhood rivals, 2 friends, 2 enemies. When these 2 characters meet at the start of this book, after not having seen each other for many years, they're enemies. It was just like fun and interesting to dive into that kind of dynamic where, you know, the characters have such a loaded history and there's like a lot of tension and they are like at odds with each other. And so that was like one of the most fun parts about drafting this book, was that I think it taught me a lot about character writing and how the dynamic of your characters and their relationships affect like the tone of your story. These 2 characters are not like, they don't get along for like personality reasons, but not any like tangible reasons. Whereas in this draft that I actually finished this year, sort of changed like who they are and what their history is. And so they are like properly at odds with each other, and every part of like who they are and how they are positioned in society puts them against each other. Yeah, the plot for this book is a certified mess. And I think what I realized most of all from writing this is that I think I need to hone my craft a lot more before I can truly tackle this story again. Like, I'm happy that I wrote it because I don't think you should ever be so intimidated by a story idea that you don't write it, you know? Because I think a lot of us can probably relate to this feeling of like, I really want to write this story, but I don't know if I'm good enough to write this idea or to actually like execute this idea. And I think in general, you should just like write it. Like, you'll learn a lot from just writing it, even if you don't execute it the way that you want it to. I don't really see all of the shortcomings of this draft as a failure necessarily, even though when I was in the middle of drafting it, I definitely did see it as a failure because I was just really hard on myself, and I was just really disappointed at how my plot threads did not come together in this first draft. But now that I've had time to kind of like step back and re-examine it, there were a lot of lessons that I learned from the whole process. So next we have June, and this is the novella. I wrote about 10,000 words of it in April of 2021. And so basically, this novella is a spin-off of Project Moon, which is the book I just talked about, and it happens before the events of that book. So this is basically like a bildungsroman type story that follows the life of an orphan named June, and you basically follow him like from his childhood all the way into his 20s. So he's an orphan that grows up in the slums of the imperial capital city, and one day he befriends a boy that he realizes is not just another orphan like him, but is he's in hiding, and he's actually someone that's very closely connected to some key political figures in the war that's kind of like raging on in the background. The reason I started writing this novella is because there's a side character in Project Moon that was super underdeveloped, and I needed to know more about who that character was. So I started outlining his backstory, and while I was doing that, I was like, this could be a whole other book. I also took the drafting process for this novella as like an opportunity to flesh out my world building, because Project Moon, essentially, like all four of those main characters are like literally traveling as part of the royal entourage. So the parts of the world that you see in that book are pretty much, you know, they're in and out of the imperial courtrooms a lot. It's very focused on like the people in power and like those power squabbles. But in this novella, you follow the underprivileged people in this city, and you kind of see how the war would have truly affected the common folk, you know? And I think there was a part of me that really wanted to like gain a more holistic view of the world that I was trying to write, because I didn't want to just like understand, like I didn't want to like have my world building feel like it was happening in a vacuum. And so I think taking the time to like step away and like explore a different side of my world building was very valuable to me. I think on top of that, this book, I chose to write it in first person because it's a, you know, I kind of wanted that like bildungsroman type vibe. And so the narrative is much more intimate, which is just a really fun change of pace, I think, because I don't write a lot in first person anymore. It's just not conducive to most of my story ideas, unless it's a short story. So it was like really fun to be able to like get back into that first person narrative. And also, you know, this story isn't so much about the war or magic or politics. All of that is like secondary to the experience of this normal person just like being thrown into extraordinary circumstances. And I wrote it really just for myself, I think, to again like understand my world building better, but also to understand my side characters better. And so in writing a little bit of this novella, I got like a really strong picture of like who this character really is and how he grew up and, you know, what shaped his life experiences. And so when I went back to write Project Moon and this side character shows up halfway through the book, I felt like I really had a good grasp on him. And I think also it allowed me to kind of like push my prose out of my usual style. I think it's genuinely some of my favorite stuff that I've written this year. I do want to finish it eventually. Like, I don't know if I'll ever really like publish it. I don't really know if I could just publish just this novella. I don't think that this is like the type of book that I could query, you know, just because in the landscape of traditional pub fantasy, I don't know what the hook would be for this book. It doesn't have kind of that like high concept flair. Yeah, I don't know what my plans are for this novella, really, but I had a lot of fun writing it. Project Night. You can tell by the deep sigh that I just let out that I'm still in the middle of drafting this. This is an adult fantasy, and yeah, I'm currently still in the trenches with this one. So this book takes place in a setting that is inspired by early 20th century Philippines. There's some Filipino folklore elements in it, and it is a mostly dual POV narrative. It follows two characters named Annalyn and Felix, who, for their own reasons, cross paths and form a tenuous alliance to try and uncover the truth behind a series of strange events that are happening in the city. I'm sorry that that's like the most boring description of this plot ever. I can't really talk about like the specifics of the lore because I'm still writing it. And I feel like when I'm in the middle of drafting a story, I'm just like way too attached to the plot still. And I can't really like think clearly. I can't speak about it clearly. But yeah, the vibes are basically like jazz age, colonialism, folklore, gang politics. So I made this an adult fantasy because it felt right. Like I just felt like the characters were speaking to me and begging to be in their mid-20s. But with that said, I've been going back and forth trying to decide if it should be a YA. I'll have a clearer picture of the demographic after I finish the first draft. Another huge struggle for me was that my main characters, personality-wise, were really hard to nail down. Well, I'm still writing it, so I'm still having a bit of an issue with them but it was more prominent at the beginning because I didn't feel like I knew them the way that I knew the cast of Project Moon super well. So it was like really hard to get out of their minds. And it also felt like when I started writing Anna and Felix, I felt like I was meeting strangers for the first time. But, you know, I'm slowly starting to understand who Anna and Felix are now and, you know, what their internal conflicts are. And I do think that plot-wise, the story for Project Night is a bit more, it's definitely more comprehensible, more engaging, and that is encouraging because I do feel like my ability to lay out plot events improved, taking those lessons that I had learned from Project Moon and applying them to Project Night. Still having some clarity issues with writing the climax and the ending of this book at the moment, but there are no like huge major plot holes, unlike when I was drafting Project Moon and I just like had ridiculous plot holes that completely blindsided me. But yeah, Project Night is definitely plot-wise, I think the best thing I've written. Prose is a different story. Not happy with my first draft prose in this story so far. I had a hard time nailing down the tone of this book for a really long time. I think I'm only now like finding it. I'm like 72,000 words into the draft and only now have I found what kind of tone and style I want to have for this story. But yeah, I'm very excited to finish the first draft of this. The end is very near. I can taste it. Okay, that's a wrap on 2021. Obviously, I've chatted extensively about my writing projects over in my writing vlogs. So this video is kind of just like a huge summary of all of my vlogs pretty much. But yeah, if you're curious to see how my drafting process has been going, you can check out my Writing Diaries series. And that is all. I hope your projects are going well. Thank you for watching this super self-indulgent video. I had a lot of fun talking about my writing because I've never shared this much. But yeah, I'd love to know what y'all are working on and what your plans are for the new year, if you have any writing goals. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.
Been a few weeks and we're keeping this up. Difficult to deny we're on the cusp of something more.